30 years ago, Britain went to war, probably for the last time all on its own, without allies. That extraordinary conflict, which I reported as a journalist, boosted Britain's confidence at home and standing abroad. It achieved a famous victory many doubted could be won, transformed the fortunes of one Prime Minister and played a part in persuading another that the British people approve of wars. And while the 1982 Argentine invaders surrendered, their government today still clamours noisily for possession. Seriously recognised before it was fought and has since cost us billions. The island's inhabitants remain the 3,000 most expensively defended people on Earth. The 1982 South Atlantic campaign was a triumph for the armed forces. But as for its place in history, or was it just a dramatic diversion on the path of our decline? Even home, Britain's Prime Minister came here to the unlikely setting of Cheltenham.
We were determined to overcome. And that is increasingly the mood of Britain. Now, once again, Britain is not prepared to be pushed around. We have ceased to be a nation in retreat. Yeah.
The modern Falklands saga began 8,000 miles south of Cheltenham, where a national government was struggling with economic woes and bitter unpopularity. The Argentine military dictatorship decided that a short, sharp triumph over British colonialism was just what it needed to rescue its fortunes. On April 2nd, 1982, its forces invaded one of the last outposts of the British Empire, a cluster of islands few people had ever thought about. The landing of Argentine Marines prompted a brief frenzy of triumphalism in Buenos Aires and a huge political crisis in Britain.
The world at one this Friday lunchtime.
Argentine Marines are reported to have landed on the Falklands.
I dropped everything to fight for a berth with Thatcher's task force because I thought that it was going to be... For 10 weeks of 1982, the Falklands conflict gripped the imagination of the world.
Both ships were hit. Sir Galahad was immediately in flames. The helicopters queued up to join the perilous rescue. The mark of war will never be erased from the island's life.
It became the most extraordinary experience of my life and of many others who sailed and marched with the task force.
There is a white flag flying over Stanley. Very marvellous.
In 1968, HMS Eagle, Ark Royal's sister ship, quit Hong Kong. A nation that wants to call itself a great power must be capable of independent action. The Labour government's withdrawal of our forces from east of Suez proclaimed to the world that this was no longer possible for impoverished Britain.
We are withdrawing more quickly from the Far East and the Middle East and making big consequential...
As part of a series of 1960s defence cuts, plans to replace the strike carriers Eagle and Ark Royal were branded unaffordable and cancelled. Within a decade, both ships would be decommissioned, leaving Britain without a big carrier to project power of the East. Yet in 1975, a politician thrust herself to the front of the national stage who did know what she wanted Britain to be. Margaret Thatcher was elected leader of the Conservative Party.
We're not living up to the best in our character.
In speeches delivered at the low point of Britain's post-war fortunes, she offered a vision of a nation that might once again achieve self-respect.
The same spirit that made us a great nation is still there, but somehow we're not using it.
There was an awful sense of the inevitability of decline, an economy that was stuck in the past, in us, on the problem.
I do not intend to be the first woman Prime Minister of a mediocre and declining Britain.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister.
When the Conservatives won the 1979 election, Mrs. Thatcher got her chance to reverse the nation's course.
There is now work to be done.
But her first years saw strikes, soaring inflation, civil disorder, and harsh economic medicine.
I will not change just to court popularity.
Even Thatcher, the proponent of British greatness, determined to save money by imposing yet further reductions on the armed forces. The Royal Navy was to shrink by 20%. Its newest and most expensive ship, Invincible, faced the axe. Her crew, which included Prince Andrew, were told that their vessel, Pride of the Fleet, was to be sold to Australia.
Naturally, we think we serve in the best ship in the Royal Navy. We're all very happy with her, and we're most disappointed that she is going to leave us.
The sale of Invincible was all the more painful because the ship heralded a new age in naval aviation. Much smaller than the old Ark Royal, she could nonetheless provide a platform for the revolutionary Sea Harrier fighter. The cuts devastated the first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach.
He and John Knott, the Defence Secretary, simply could not get on at all. John Knott was determined to castrate the Royal Navy.
For Leach, the sale of Invincible was the ultimate betrayal. The Thatcher government's brutal defence review caused morale in the sea service to plummet. Young officers, such as Chris Parry then was, racked their brains about what they might do to prove that the Navy still served a purpose.
Everybody was not too difficult, not too easy, and we eventually settled on a country which we thought was just about right.
Because if we do not, in another few months we shall be living in a different country whose word counts for little. They also determined Thatcher to fight. HMS Invincible sailed for the South Atlantic just days later, the deal with the Australians suspended. She was joined by Hermes, designated flagship of the Royal Navy's biggest task force since Suez. Hermes had been reprieved from the breakers' yard. The Royal Navy had to requisition two of the country's most famous cruise liners to transport the troops. Mrs. Thatcher was determined to reverse a political humiliation which some thought would break her government. I sailed on Canberra. It was an emotional moment, casting off for the 8,000-mile passage to the Falklands. It was a weird feeling to be preparing for war aboard a cruise liner, though at that stage few of us really believed it would come to a fight. I'd reported many conflicts, but never a big British naval and military operation. There was something very special about going to watch one's own people fight. Slowly, we came to understand that the Prime Minister, having determined upon a showdown, was throwing every resource at Britain's command into her huge gamble.
Margaret Thatcher said once you deter...
The amphibious force approached the Falklands after 6 weeks at sea. War had by now suddenly become intensely real. The task force faced a deadly threat from the Argentine Air Force, which battered the Royal Navy. Who was still flying fast jets? He and his fellow airmen provided the air support which alone made it narrowly feasible to recover the Falklands.
25 I was, very much a surprise and very exciting. We were providing air cover, so just our presence there.
Thatcher's government had cause to be very grateful that Invincible had not been flogged off. Sea Harriers were responsible for the destruction of most of the Argentine aircraft destroyed.
I think it was 22 we shot down for no loss. So we really...
In one way, most of us found that sodden island comfortingly familiar, like Dartmoor or the Hebrides. But the icy cold and wet, the need for thousands of troops carrying heavy loads to walk, to yomp, as Marines put it, imposed a huge strain on every man. The one big advantage we had in that conflict was that it was militarily simple. If only we could take the island's capital, Port Stanley, where most of the enemy were dug in, we would have won. The fiercest fighting of the war followed. The British brilliantly exploited their skills, first yomping, patrolling and mine clearing, then staging night assaults on strongly held enemy positions. The superiority of our men to the enemy's half-hearted conscripts really told. However tough that campaign, it perfectly suited the qualities of Britain's armed forces. On the 14th of June, the Argentines surrendered. Marching into Port Stanley, although filthy and utterly exhausted, every man in the task force shared a euphoric high. Their arrival home sparked extraordinary British celebrations of a kind unseen since 1945. Many men returning from the South Atlantic felt that they landed in a different Britain.
When we left Portsmouth, beat country, when we came back in July, we returned to a country that had a spring in its step. It was confident again, looking forward to the future.
You thought that the qualities which made this nation great still lived in its people today. A task force showed the way last spring, and our country found its soul.
The Falklands lit a candle of hope in many breasts that we weren't doomed forever to live with national decline. The war had nothing to do with Britain's real problems in 1982, but it was nonetheless for many of us a transforming moment and sent the reputation of the armed forces.
With my son waving a greenberry out the window, and you couldn't get through Bridport because of the pints of beer that were being brought out to it.
I think it cascaded. I believe it raised morale in the armed forces themselves because they had the chance to do something serious and they did it well.
The US military were mightily impressed. Peter Babington witnessed their reaction firsthand when he described his experiences to several thousand American Marines. While the British celebrated, around the world, even nations with no cause to love us were impressed by what our armed forces had done.
They were worried because they suddenly realized that a NATO country that wasn't America, i.e. a European NATO country, would fight for a principle, and that perhaps NATO wasn't such a pushover.
A picture of HMS Hermes steaming south and the headline, "The Empire Strikes Back." It showed that Britain was not to be taken for granted.
Margaret Thatcher found her personal standing transformed by the war. A sea change first signalled at the Beaconsfield by-election fought on the 27th of May at the height of the conflict.
Succeeding Prime Minister Clay, it gave her a sort of aura. The
Conservatives went on to win the 1983 general election with some help from the dire state of Michael Foot's Labour Party, but also from a popular revival which had started in the South Atlantic. Adversaries met again for the 25th anniversary commemoration of the Falklands War. Blair was then in the last weeks of his own premiership. He told an interviewer that as national leader, he would have responded to the Argentine invasion just as Mrs. Thatcher did. The Falklands conflict left a legacy that powerfully influenced both and which is still evident in Britain's foreign commitments. In 1990, Kuwait was invaded by the Iraqi army, sparking a new international crisis in Mrs. Thatcher's last months of power. She urged the Americans to lead a stand against Saddam Hussein.
Iraq's invasion of Kuwait defies every principle for which the United Nations stands. If we let it succeed, no small country can ever feel safe again.
Thatcher promised British military support for the American-led coalition to free Kuwait. For decades, the great powers had been wary of joining wars, especially in the Middle East, amid the threat of nuclear Armageddon. But the Falklands War made force seem once more a practical option, including for British prime ministers.
War became a usable instrument. It got us over the... So it made war usable. So that was the long-term foreign policy effect.
53,000 British personnel deployed with the coalition to free Kuwait. The Falklands would be the last war Britain was capable of fighting alone. Ironically, renewed defence cuts by Mrs. Thatcher had left our military barely capable of fielding an armoured division. The operation was swift and successful. Once again, Western governments got the message that war could work.
I do think
But the Bush-Blair alliance, first to fight in Afghanistan and then to invade Iraq, changed everything. British governments now learnt painful lessons about the perils of following our key ally too blindly, too far, despite all their mutual exchanges of flattery.
Prime Minister, the entire world salutes you and your gallant people and gallant nation.
Yet, contrary to the legend of Margaret Thatcher's cosy relationship with Ronald Reagan, the Falklands War tested the Anglo-American alliance to its limits. In 1982, it was a bitter revelation for the Prime Minister to discover that most of the administration, including the President, wanted to withhold support from Britain.
It's a very difficult situation for the United States because we're friends with both of the countries engaged in this dispute.
Reagan was told by key advisors that a Falklands War might damage Washington's South American clients. UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick was foremost among those anxious for the welfare of the fascist junta in Buenos Aires.
The Argentines, of course, have claimed for 200 years that they own those islands, and the British have claimed that they own those islands. And we have said we have no position on who owns those islands. Now, if the Argentines own the islands, then moving troops into them is not armed aggression.
As British troops prepared to make their final push for Port Stanley, Kirkpatrick urged Reagan to make Thatcher hold back from humiliating Argentina on the battlefield,
saying, "I have to take them now. I didn't lose some of my best ships and some of my finest lives to leave quietly after a ceasefire without the Argentines withdrawing."
It was amazing luck that the United States Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger was a staunch Anglophile. He, almost single-handed, secured critical weapons, intelligence and logistical support for the British Falklands War effort. British policymakers learnt their lesson from that experience, that we better fight our future wars with the Americans or not at all. Since 1982, British defence policy has been ever more closely locked into alliances for political advantage and from military necessity. In 2003, Tony Blair's government deployed 46,000 British servicemen in Iraq. It was the last time in history that Britain would own soldiers to send such numbers to war, and the story had no happy ending. In 2006, the armed forces, fresh from perceived failure in Iraq, accepted a dramatically expanded role in Afghanistan. Tony Blair dispatched a brigade to...
In the case of both
Iraq and Afghanistan, the military were very gung-ho, were very keen to be involved, because...
There's no doubt in my mind, from my own experience, utility into the future. And there was this idea, frankly.
But in Helmand, the army found itself fighting battles as fierce as any since the Falklands. And even when they won the firefights, they proved unable to force an outcome in an intensely political conflict.
Just as we...
The South Atlantic conflict brought a joyous British public onto the streets to celebrate a swift success.
Ashes to ashes.
Most of the 255 servicemen who died in the Falklands were buried where they fell in accordance with tradition. But the Joneses joined a campaign to have their son brought home.
Amen.
And we wrote to so many people.
In November 1982, Craig Jones's body arrived home with those of 63 comrades at a low-key harbourside ceremony. The public scarcely noticed, but a precedent was set for the return of our dead from foreign fields that's now become a focus for public sentiment. Some politicians question whether, after the Iraq and Afghan experiences, the public will ever again support deployment of a big army abroad unless Britain is directly threatened. The Cameron government has been strongly influenced by public opinion in its decision to seek an early exit from Afghanistan. Early in December 2010, the 1980s vintage carrier Ark Royal made its last voyage. To save cash, the carrier, along with the Harriers decisive for Falklands victory, were to be scrapped.
Every nation is hopeless at predicting what the next war will be like. Where's the threat coming from? What you have to do is...
You cannot have forces that are too rigid, too focused on specific threats.
One of the best results of the Falklands War was that it caused the fall of Argentina's military dictatorship. The country has been a democracy ever since, but Britain's 30th anniversary present from the current government is a bombardment of angry words renewing its claim to the islands. Argentine TV broadcast an advertisement professing to show what life would be like on the Falklands if they become Las Malvinas.
Wake up, it's a beautiful morning, have a nice day.
The 1982 story isn't over. Britain faces real dilemmas about how to... We should remember it, though, with pride, something Britain did really well. We stood alone in a good cause against the dictatorship's armed aggression. We fought and won the Falklands War.
Never fights. But as for its place in history...